Model native townships in South Africa during the first half of the 20th century, Conceptualization, Contextualisation and Visualization by Carina Sevenhuysen from the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies at the University of Pretoria in Pretoria, South Africa. This historical investigation into the origins and context of the idea of a model native township during the first half of the 20th century in South Africa utilizes three historical methodological approaches. Firstly, conceptualization refers to the use of abstract ideas to assist in the understanding of complex aspects relating to model native townships. Secondly, contextualization refers to the process of understanding the circumstances that create or form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, in terms of which it can be fully and better understood. Especially in historical research, contextualization is the golden thread that combines understanding, empathy, not apology, analysis, and relevant time and place specific deductions. The third concept, visualization, refers to the physiological and imaginative process of forming a mental image of a specific idea or concept. This process assists in understanding by transforming an abstract construct into a more concrete and relatable image. The place of visualization in the understanding of abstract and complicated concepts and contexts is illustrated through sketches and diagrams. A single still image with a few well-chosen words is often more effective than a long verbal description. This presentation will argue that visual imagery should support written work and enhances the understanding of complex and multifaceted concepts and contexts. The conceptual origins of model housing can be traced back to three major ideas that were part of the British as well as European and American states during the late 19th and early 20th century, namely modernism or modernity, the welfare state, and the sanitation syndrome. As South Africa was at that stage still part of the British sphere of influence, the prevailing ideas on town planning policies and practices were also applied in South Africa, albeit with a different focus. Modernism was characterized by a conscious break from traditional ideas and the focus on new, innovative, and more liberal ideas during the rise of capitalism, industrialization, secularism, rationalization, the nation-state, and its resulting institutions and forms of control. The consequences were not always positive and often detrimental to humankind, due to the focus on progress for the sake of progress, structure, and rules. Modernity refers more specifically to the social relations resulting from the rise of industrialization and capitalism and an increase in formal social organization and the segmentation of the population, the so-called social engineering. In architecture and urban planning, the impact of modernism or modernity resulted in the idea of the knowledgeable professional man who had to be in control of planning and the solving and prevention of social, especially housing, problems on behalf of the ignorant public, often the working class. In South Africa, the focus of the practical implementation of social organization was determined by the policy of segregation and race-based residential segregation. Within the context of modernity, the welfare state concept refers to a state with highly developed social services. Furthermore, the state accepts the core responsibility to provide these services of a certain minimum standard to citizens who are unable to provide these services and standard of services to themselves. Within the welfare state, the idea of social upliftment and rehabilitation also stands central. It was especially the work and influence of Octavia Hill and William Beveridge in Britain that focused on upliftment of the poor working class and the eradication of social evils like squalor, ignorance, want, idleness, and disease through welfare services and state intervention. The welfare state concept started to gain momentum within the South African context during the 1930s. Despite the strong racial and racist underpinning of the time, many leading administrators like Douglas Smith and Henry Gluckman recommended the implementation of social services to all the needy in South Africa, irrespective of class and race. A concept relating to the idea of eradicating these social evils through the mechanisms of the welfare state is the sanitation syndrome. In this context, sanitation refers to aspects relating to public health conditions and how to improve them, and syndrome to a characteristic combination of opinions, emotions, and behavior that is not based on a concrete, rational, or empiric conclusion based on facts, but it is based on the emotional, the irrational, and the unfounded. According to this syndrome, the ruling classes, especially in Britain, but also in South Africa, were very concerned with epidemics and disease during the 19th and early 20th century. It was believed that certain classes, and in the case of South Africa, certain races, were more unhygienic than other classes or races, and that they were responsible for the origin and spreading of disease and epidemics. This fear of the ruling class was used and manipulated for political, economic, and personal gain. The idea that certain classes and races were responsible for disease was used as a justification to separate, dare one say, quarantine these groups from the rest of the more hygienic society. The fact that these groups worked with and for the rest of society, and therefore could still infect them, illustrates the irrational and racist emotions and behavior resulting from the sanitation syndrome. In South Africa, the notion of quarantine, a medical and health measure, was combined with segregation, a political measure of control through separation. The idea of model housing was at the time part of the British urban planning objective and vision of rational and uplifting city layout and planning as embodied in the Octavia Hill system and as a consequence of the welfare state concept. These ideas found practical implementation in working class housing of metropolitan cities in the so-called garden style. The latter architectural movement promoted an urban layout plan, design and buildings according to a master plan where residents were surrounded by green belts with sufficient space for houses, industries and agriculture. The origin of this style or movement can be found in several 19th century philanthropic schools of thought that proposed the development of utopian residential areas for factory workers to combat the squalor brought on by rapid industrialization. This idea in Britain was focused on class, working class. However, in South Africa the focus was on both class, poor workers, and race, poor black workers. How did we get to model native townships? If you take model housing combined with the South African context, The result was model native townships. The South African political, economic and social context during the first half of the 20th century that underlay the notion of the model native township is multifaceted and intertwined. Aspects of philanthropy, meaning the pursuit to lessen the poverty and suffering of the less fortunate, and social Darwinism, referring to Charles Darwin's ideas of natural selection and the survival of the fittest, where wealth was a sign of success and poverty an indication of unfitness to survive, were intertwined with other key notions. These include patriarchy, paternalism, liberalism, which meant at that stage qualified equality and freedom, and segregation, both single-minded and double-minded segregationists. The remaining focus of this presentation will be on the two key concepts of paternalism and segregation, which played a pivotal role in the implementation of model native townships in the first half of the 20th century South Africa. Paternalism comes from the Latin paternus, meaning like a father, and it involves the exercising of control over or care for subordinates in a father-like or like a trustee manner, without giving them any say in their own affairs. Here, control relates to strong paternalism and care to weak paternalism. Within this particular context, two key aspects are therefore of importance and interrelated to one another: control or discipline and responsibility for care and welfare, as defined by the specific group or society by which paternalism is practiced. The social historian Charles van Onselen describes these two seemingly contradicting components of paternalism very accurately and appropriately as part chain, part umbilical cord. The relationship is thus characterized by connectedness, whether by chain or umbilical cord. The image that is used for the visualization of the concept of paternalism relates to van Onselen's description and might be regarded as shocking and even distasteful. However, this image conveys the essence of this very intrigued, contrasting and nuanced concept perfectly and will not soon be forgotten. And here you can see the connectedness between chain and umbilical cord, a connectedness between chain and umbilical cord. It is being split here, the chain aspect and the umbilical cord aspect, where the chain aspect refers to strong paternalism and furthermore to control, political control and the manner of governing, and more personally to discipline and even the use of violence on the subordinates, with the emphasis on total obedience towards the patriarch or father, thus a formal and impersonal relationship or connectedness. If we look at the umbilical cord part, which can be referred to as weak paternalism, that implies responsibility for the welfare of the subordinate. Here the conduct of the father towards the subordinates is more generous and concerned, although still strict. It even implies the development of a feeling of intimacy and a personal bond between the father and the subordinates. Subordinates were expected to express gratitude and even loyalty towards the paternalist or father, thus a much more intimate and personal relationship or connectedness. turning to the second key concept of segregation. Segregation is derived from the Latin segregare, meaning separate from the flock, and it was, in a South African context, a social or political system or policy according to which races, classes, or ethnic groups were separated by legislation. Among the supporters of segregation, a distinction can be made between conservative and liberal segregationists. It is important to recognize the difference between these two groups, but still be aware that they were similar in the racial and racist foundation of their beliefs and outlook. These different nuances in outlook can be linked to paternalism, namely strong paternalism corresponds to the view of conservative segregationists, while weak paternalism to the view of liberal segregationists. The following diagram indicates the main differences and nuances between liberal and conservative segregationists. Conservative segregationists, or single-minded, because they only thought about themselves to a certain extent, also in line with strong paternalism, they emphasized the permanent differences between whites and blacks. These differences, amongst others in the level of civilization, according to them, necessitated a policy of segregation or separation. They enforced the policy of separation by means of repression and subjugation and were openly and uncompromisingly racist. On the other hand, your liberal segregationist, also known as double-minded, thinking not just about themselves but apparently also about the black population group, they therefore thoughts linked up with weak paternalism. They also supported a policy of separation because of the differences between whites and blacks. However, they emphasized differentiation and believed that the policy of segregation had to be a compromise between the protection of their own identity and meaningful assimilation on the one hand, and repression and subjugation on the other hand. They realized that the differences will not always be there and eventually would disappear. They therefore encouraged upliftment that eventually would result in the disappearance of the differences between whites and blacks. They tried to promote and practice a more humanitarian or humane policy towards blacks. However, liberal segregationists were often accused of disguising their racism by trying to give their racist notions a respectable appearance. The actions of liberal white officials in the early half of the 20th century South Africa, who tried to create quality housing for urban blacks, can in all probability be seen as partly philanthropic, where urban blacks were being freed from their poverty and suffering. However, their actions leaned more towards paternalism, where the officials wanted to care for the black children under their control and where they regarded themselves as responsible for their welfare. Their liberalism had more to do with humanity and social welfare than rights. For them, liberalism seemed to have been synonymous with such qualities as a sense of fair play and justice. They believed, clearly paternalistic, that local authorities had an obligation and social responsibility to provide adequate accommodation for African laborers. Within the context of South Africa of the first half of the 20th century, 4 categories of meaning relating to a model native township can be distinguished. Some of these meanings are closer to the contemporary then meaning or context, while others made use of interpretations closer to the current time period, the then and now context, by questioning and analyzing the mindsets and behavior from a postmodern perspective. The sketch that is used for the visualization of the different categories of meaning within the available research is the prism, where the refraction of light, there you can see it, the refraction of light indicates the degree of deviation from the contemporary meaning of the concept. Thus, from the top then and closest to the original intended meaning, the first meaning relates to a model layout and design, adhering to specific measurements and criteria, a model experience by the Black urban inhabitants of quality designed housing, infrastructure and living space, model conduct by the inhabitants where the acceptable conduct is based on what was regarded as acceptable within a Western, Christian, Protestant or Calvinistic society, and lastly, a model control mechanism to be used or abused by a domineering and paternalistic government. The last meaning attributed to the concept might be seen as too narrow and one-sided. However, it is still insightful. It is clear that a combination of meanings should be accepted and investigated in order to get an inclusive, well-rounded and balanced interpretation of the concept of a model native township. In conclusion, the use of conceptualization, contextualization, and visualization in historical investigations contribute to a better, more nuanced, and well-rounded understanding and comprehension of complex and abstract ideas and historical phenomena. Thank you.